Emil Kadlik here with FantasyNation.com. I've got a wonderful pioneer of fantasy sports today. She started her career in 2001, a long time ago. She's had a fantastic career. She was an important person at the Fantasy Sports Trade Association in supporting fantasy sports legally and fighting against the stigma of gambling. And now she's the president of the Fantasy Sports Gaming Association, which changed their title and some of their scope. And she's also the Government Affairs Director of FanDuel. Wonderful to introduce Stacie Stern.
Hi, Emil. Nice to see you. Thanks for having me.
Oh, congratulations on your wonderful career.
Thank you. I'm really blessed.
Yeah, it's fantastic. Let's start at the beginning. When you were a kid, were you involved in sports?
Oh, definitely. So I remember watching sports a lot with my dad, as probably many people did. So I was a young girl who grew up loving the Phoenix Suns and Arizona State football because I grew up in the Phoenix, Arizona area. And the only professional team that I had to root for were the Phoenix Suns. So, and I remember watching college football and loving it, knowing there was something really special about it. And then as my playing career, I grew up playing mostly softball, a little bit of volleyball and basketball, but I'm a short person in stature, so I was limited with volleyball and basketball. So I played softball throughout high school.
Wow, very good. So as you were growing up, did you have any goals of what you wanted to do with your life?
Yeah, originally I thought I was going to be a sportscaster or a sideline reporter, but I always knew I wanted to do something in sports. I wasn't sure what the path would be. So originally in college, I started out as a broadcast major, which I quickly changed. As I saw myself on camera and discussing sports, which I loved just for fun, I didn't like the way that I looked on camera. I didn't like the way I talked. I was super critical. So I decided to change to a political science major and skipped broadcasting from then on out.
Wow. Big change in college. What college did you go to?
Yes. Arizona State.
I should have known that. Well, Arizona's a wonderful state. I live in New Mexico. We're very similar as far as the climate and beauty. So you went to college, you got this degree, and then did you go out and get a job initially? And how did that evolve into fantasy sports?
So interestingly enough, as I graduated and I met my husband at Arizona State, and he decided to take the broadcasting path. So we moved to Maryland, to the Eastern Shore, a little town called Salisbury. And he was the morning news anchor for the ABC affiliate in what's called the Delmarva Peninsula. And so I moved with him back in 1999, and we stayed there until 2001 while he pursued his dream of broadcasting. While he was there, he realized it wasn't his dream, so we moved back to Arizona. And when we moved back to Arizona, a friend of mine said, "Hey, my boyfriend works at this company. I don't know what it is. It might be sports betting or something like that, fantasy sports. But they're looking for a marketing director. You should apply." And I had never played fantasy sports, which, by the way, with as big of a sports fan as I was and somebody who was fascinated by reading box scores, I don't know how I never found out about this awesome hobby that I ended up becoming obsessed with. So needless to say, the interview went well. I was hired on in August of 2001 and fell in love instantly with fantasy sports.
Who interviewed you? Do you remember?
Yes, the founder of the company, Bill Reinking. So it was a small little company. They'd been in existence since 1994 in Arizona and just had created their website maybe a year before. So he was really on the cutting edge of technology for, fantasy sports and operating a website and offering these season-long salary cap style contests. So anyway, he hired me on and I came on as the marketing director, but I also got to learn really how the business ran, from beginning to end product that we delivered to the customer.
Speaking of the website, I don't know if you can see on how you've positioned. That's 2000.
Oh my goodness. Look at that. Oh, I'm getting a little sentimental. Yes. And everything was in those little bursts. We thought those bursts were great.
Oh, yes.
Goodness.
And they were probably fantastic back then. It's a beautiful, for 2001, it's a beautiful site. And I don't have too many pages, but I would have one other surprise a little later. But yeah, that's a pretty one. I actually found in 1996, which I didn't put it up. It's real crude. It was head-to-head, and it was just like this. Somebody just put it up on the site. It really didn't have much on it from the Wayback Machine. So that's a fantastic one. So tell me about marketing. I mean, you didn't have, I'm curious what kind of marketing you were doing, and when you went to school, you didn't really do marketing, and when you went to school, or did you do some marketing?
No, I didn't do marketing. And so the fact that Bill brought me on in that role was great. I think it was because I had a real working knowledge of sports and how sports worked. I was interested in customer service. I had been selling advertising. Dating back to in high school, my job was I worked at a golf and tennis store, and I kept that job through college. So I was always kind of in a customer relations role anyway. But I think the ability to understand sports, learn fantasy sports, and then work with vendors such as newspapers. So at that time in 2001, 2002, the best way to get new players was to run ads in newspapers across the country. And sometimes it would just be, a half-page ad where it would talk about the game and how to register, and people would mail in a check, and we would get those checks, and then we would set up their account, and then they would go in at a later time and either enter their lineup on the computer, or for people who didn't have computers, they would call our customer service agents, and they would enter a lineup over the phone using the salaries that we created for each, player, whether it was football, basketball, baseball. So it was quite, heavy customer service. We used Microsoft Access for our database information. And it was back in those days, you would enter the statistics or enter the salaries. You would pause the website, and then you would upload information and then turn the site back on.
Wow. That's
I know, it was crazy.
And that was modern. But at that point, that was like, wow, modern. Because the internet really had started to, become more and more useful, and people were on it more.
That's right.
So go ahead. I'm sorry.
It was a really fascinating way for me to learn business, but also fantasy sports business, be connected to the customers who were calling in. I tried to take a lot of calls just to hear what was going on, concerns, questions people had. And then that way we could troubleshoot and be on top of, things that would be important for people to see and understand on the website.
Well, that's a fantastic idea to really listen to the customer, obviously, and be part of the calls. Now, did you do the salary cap numbers? Did you calculate the salary caps? Tell us about
So when I first started doing salaries would have been back in 2004. And I had learned from Bill and another person at the company, basically how they would evaluate, how they would create formulas for different players. And it was based a little bit on past performance, a little bit on projections, and then also on the style of our game specifically. It was a roster of 10 players. We used a pitching staff in baseball, for example, instead of individual pitchers.
Okay.
And that made it. So that was a little bit interesting because it was kind of this, hey, this fantasy baseball game is for everybody. We think that even the beginners can play fantasy baseball in a salary cap style and using a staff and getting points for a win, as opposed to using like the 5x5 roto style for scorekeeping. It made it more manageable for people throughout the season. So it was a unique scoring system. And, I think I finally got a handle on how to create those salaries and formulas starting in about 2004. So, and then from then on out, golf and college football became really my responsibility.
Ah, cool. Did you know fantasy golf started in the 1950s?
I did not know that, but I'm not
Yes.
surprised by that.
It's one of the
It really
original.
does lend itself to fantasy. Yeah, it really
Well,
does.
and it was simple. And of course, also fantasy baseball started in the late 50s because those were the two most
Hmm.
popular sports. Also, football hadn't really come around yet. So
Right.
the I had a funny another one to put up here. You created the draft, the high stakes draft in '03.
Yes. In '03.
Yeah,
That's right.
tell us
God,
about that.
we were ahead of our time. This was a great story. So in probably the summer of 2002, Bill Ryan King, and he brought in a new partner, Kevin Grayland, and I discussed, people really want to put money behind their fantasy football stakes because they believe they are the most knowledgeable. They believe they're the smartest. And so we started working on a high stakes draft. It was a $5,000 entry fee. And at the time, it was a $250,000 grand prize. We held it at the Venetian in Las Vegas. So we knew that a destination was important. We knew that high stakes was important to really get the best of the best, we thought. As we were into 2003 and probably April and May, we realized maybe there isn't a big audience for a $5,000 entry fee. So we had to pivot a little bit. We only were able to fill 3 leagues, but we had a boatload of hotel rooms that were associated with the conference room that we had rented for the draft, all these draft boards, all kinds of things going along with it. So we did end up promoting a free draft to those who could come and purchase a room at the Venetian for 2 nights. And then we put up like a $10,000 grand prize for that draft. So it was a pretty interesting dynamic of people who were willing to spend $5,000 in 2003, and then people who were just coming to Vegas for the weekend. But we thought we were ahead of our time with the idea of those high stakes drafts.
Yeah. Now that was called the MAD, the Members Appreciation Draft, was it not?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Boy, Emil, you are really in the Wayback Machine.
Yeah. Well, and you weren't inspired at all by the WCOFF that started in 2002?
It's funny. I don't recall that, and I do remember reading later on about the WCOFF,
Gotcha.
and but when we were talking in 2002, I don't remember seeing anything about that or.
Yeah, that was the first
and
year
actually,
of the WCOFF. We started it in the late
Yeah.
01. We started taking registration in 01, but
yeah,
those are
But I don't-
exciting times. Go ahead.
I don't think that we remember seeing anything specific about it. And I will say that one of the owners, Kevin Grayland, it was his friend who said, "Hey, how come you don't do a high stakes draft?" So I think that's where our conversation originated.
Gotcha. Yeah, those were great times. And I was looking at the site, the Head2Head, which I guess you don't work for them anymore, but they're still doing a lot of various kind of, the draft's still there. It's a low stakes now. And I think they
That's
still
right.
have salary
That's
cap
right.
too. I mean, salary cap, has been around since, I think the late 80s. A couple companies started in the late 80s. It's been around that long. It's a long time.
They have, yeah, they've been around a long time, and they are continuing to offer the same products.
That's neat. So tell me about how you got involved with the Fantasy Sports Trade Association.
It's a great question. So again, one of the owners of Head2Head Sports, Kevin Grayland, he became involved with the Fantasy Sports Trade Association. He was really a bright marketing mind who I learned a lot from, and he thought it's good for Head2Head as sort of a leader in the industry to be involved in an association with the other leaders and all sorts of companies. And it was, the companies who are providing us content and the companies who are providing us statistics. So he started to get involved, and then he insisted back in 2008 that I start attending meetings and introducing myself to people and, get to know people throughout the industry. It was at that time that he and Bill Ryan King, the founder of Head2Head Sports, decided that they were going to sell the company. And so I think they were really putting me in a position of being able to stay on in a role with whoever the next owner would be, and then meet people in the industry, which was incredibly valuable. So I'm appreciative that he talked me into becoming involved. And I loved it. The other thing was, I loved working with Head to Head. I loved working with fantasy sports. And then to meet people who are my colleagues who had that same passion, that same drive, and that same excitement, this, what's not to love, and to see what's coming next. What are people thinking? What are they delivering? What's the new product? It was really a lot of fun.
So when did you then decide you wanted to be on the board?
I ran for the board and was elected in 2011. I did some work and was on the board of the former Fantasy Sports Association, which then merged with the Fantasy Sports Trade Association. And the Fantasy Sports Association was kind of larger companies that were looking to basically get the eye of advertisers on Madison Avenue types and bring in the leagues and things like that, especially after there had been some contentious times, obviously, between the leagues and fantasy sports operators. So, but there just, again, there wasn't a real call for two organizations in the industry. So once that merger happened, my colleague and friend and longtime fantasy sports veteran, Rick Wolf, talked me into running for the board.
Fantastic. Well, that's great. You did. You've done a fantastic job. When did it start? When did you start getting involved in the legal issues as a board member?
That's a great question. So I remember being really interested in 2015, personally. In my everyday life, I sort of have been interested in politics, and I follow as much as I can. But then to think about the legality of our industry and understand that it's been under scrutiny for years, and know that we need to have laws on the books that give us credibility as to what we're doing. And a lot of that would boil down to payment processing, for example. There were points in 2014, 2015 when a lot of companies were running into issues with their payment processor that they had been with for years. Yeah. And that's just not okay. And we were, as an industry, kind of hanging our hat on the 2006 Unlawful Internet Gambling Enforcement Act carve-out that said fantasy sports contests are games of skill. They are not gambling. And trying to share that with some of these merchant processors and banks, it didn't always work out. So that's when I really became interested and involved. And then, of course, with the explosion of daily fantasy sports and FanDuel and DraftKings, and the investigation of one employee who played on the other employee's site and won money, all of a sudden, this entire industry was, being scrutinized. And I thought it was time to get out there and start beating the drum for, the validation of what fantasy sports contests are.
So what was it like meeting with representatives of different states, or did you go to Congress and have to talk in front of Congress or anything like that?
I never have had to go to DC and meet with members of Congress. It has been at the state level, and gaming itself is really a states' rights issue. And although fantasy sports aren't really gaming, a lot of times that's kind of where they would get categorized, right? Because it was like, what do we do with this contest? What do we do with this? So it was, for me, a lot of fun. I felt like this was important work to be able to travel around to the states and explain what a fantasy sports contest is, why it works the way it works, how it's more like maybe a golf tournament, and the platform providers are really more like a golf course offering this tournament to its customers. And that, trying to find what the analogy was that would work in any given state with any given legislator, depending on, their age, their understanding of sports, fantasy sports. I enjoyed that challenge because I thought that I was really sort of evangelizing or sharing the good news of fantasy sports.
Well, it's ironic or weird or whatever the word is. You got a UIGEA in 2006. So you have the Congress laid down these few paragraphs to try and define, if you do this in fantasy, it's not gambling. And when we started the WCOFF, we were very worried about it. So our lawyers interpreted it as a game of skill, a maximum number of entries, and fixed prices. So you couldn't move your prices, you couldn't move your entries, and that would be safe. But here you have an '06 ruling, and here you are in the 2015 or wherever it was, where I guess it didn't matter anymore. And I think some of that probably was due to the money that was being spent by the daily, and the politicians saw money, and all of a sudden, in my very naive opinion, they went, hey, we want some of that money. And all of a sudden it became illegal and it was a fight. What's that mean?
That's right.
Right.
That means you're on the nose. You're right.
Right.
You're exactly right. Yeah, that's right.
Wow, it was a crazy time. I mean, and I remember the Dallas meeting. I don't remember what year it was, of the FSTA. We had like 440 members, which was more than we ever had. You couldn't even find everybody. I mean, even if in the FSGA this last January, I had trouble finding guys and talking to them, just to have a chat, because it's a big organization, and you're going to have fun running it. So let's see, where am I at next? So the UIGEA. So when did you decide I wanted to run for president of the FSGA?
Oh, goodness. Let's see. So I've been serving as the vice president under Paul Charchian for the last 2.5 years. And I think I decided, that if Paul was in a mindset where he wanted to step down or not run again, that I would be interested in leading the way. So I guess maybe it was within the last year or so. And Paul Charchian, who was a wonderful president for, I think, 11 years or 12 years, and just gave his heart and soul to the organization, has become a good friend. And I think for me, feeling like at FanDuel that I have this background in fantasy sports, paid fantasy sports specifically, right? Not just the free-to-play, but paid fantasy sports contests. And then looking at this venture over into sports betting, which is a natural progression for many who play fantasy sports, I thought that gave me a good perspective on what the industry needs, especially because I'm on the ground in a lot of these states, again, talking to legislators. I field their questions, and I think by having those conversations, it gives me a lot of insight into what the industry is working on or should be working on, and what we need to deliver for our member companies.
Wow. So go back a little bit. Well, actually, let's don't go back. What are your goals for the FSGA?
Well, obviously, membership growth is going to be number one. I want to make sure that we are spreading the word and that we are allowing members from all facets of the fantasy sports and sports betting industries, and that can be providing data and content. That could be merchant processing and credit card processing, which continues to be a stickler for a lot of companies. Maybe it's the startup, the person who says, hey, I've got this great free-to-play idea that might look more like sports betting, but we're not going to charge any money for it. There are all types of companies and ideas that I really want to see our universe expand to become more inclusive. I say secretly, but maybe not so secretly, I'd love to see more women involved in sports betting. Something that we've seen in fantasy sports over the last 7 or 8 years is a huge increase in women playing fantasy sports. And I think there was intimidation for a long time, and women felt like maybe they couldn't speak up or smack talk or join a league with all men because they felt like maybe they wouldn't belong or that they didn't have the same knowledge. They do. And women love fantasy sports, and I think there are women who would love to learn more about sports betting and or participate in that at a degree where they didn't feel like it was solely dominated by men. So I'd love to see more female participation across the board.
Definitely. And, when we ran the WCFF, we had a lot of women, a small percentage, but like Kimra Schlesinger and Jewel McLean, and there was a bunch of them. They were in the top 10% of the players, and they still are. As a matter of fact, Kimra, I think she won the FFWC about 2 years ago, and that was 400 people or whatever it was, an insane amount. And she and I co-ran a team in 2015 in the NFFC and finished 3 out of 480. And I hope that helped a little bit. But I mean, obviously, it's frustrating to see those numbers out of balance. And I think you hit on it a little bit. I think it's like, if I walked into a 50,000 square foot ballroom with 95% women doing something like knitting or something that's not typically a man thing, and it's a competition,
yeah,
it's just naturally you're out of place, I guess. But hopefully we can fix that, and hopefully it'll continue to, when I say fix, hopefully, everybody should be playing. It should be 50-50. Everybody should be playing fantasy sports. And I'm not a gambler personally. I have enough trouble with my life than gambling, but a lot of people love gambling for some reason. So tell me about how you got involved with FanDuel and was able to get hired there, and how that's going.
Yeah, so as I started to travel to states on behalf of the Fantasy Sports Trade Association at the time to talk about fantasy sports, I sort of felt like I hit the wall with where I was at Head2Head Sports. We were owned by a Arlington Capital out of Arlington, Virginia, and with daily racing form. And there wasn't a lot of emphasis or investment put into Head2Head Sports at the time. So I felt like I couldn't really go further in my career. I was actually thinking of leaving the industry completely. I had another job lined up where I was just going to leave the industry, and I felt okay about it. And I made some people aware in the Fantasy Sports Trade Association arena and said I would not be able to start or continue to travel and testify on behalf of fantasy sports in front of legislatures anymore because I'm going to leave the industry. And immediately I had somebody reach out to me and say, oh my goodness, do not sign anything. Wait a minute. And this person reached out to both FanDuel and DraftKings and said, Stacie's looking to leave the industry. Somebody needs to make her an offer.
Wow.
And FanDuel did just that. And so within maybe 2 days, I had an offer from FanDuel, and it was a great offer. I already knew the team because we had been working together in legislative areas across the country, and I felt like it would be a great fit. They allowed me to stay home in Arizona to continue to raise my family and work from home. And it's been an absolute gift. So I started early January of 2017, and it's been just a fun, wild, exciting ride, and I learned something new every day.
Wow, that is fantastic. So didn't prep you on this, but do you have a story or two from the last 20 years that's funny or interesting or something like that?
Oh goodness! One of the funniest stories in the industry, and this is probably from the female perspective, right? Is in 2003 when we started our first live draft in Vegas. The draft, I had my firstborn 9 weeks before that, wow. And I was exhausted. This was a lot of fun to get to put on, but putting on a live event is a lot of work. So it was, I was still trying to nurse my son, and I was trying to figure out how to be a working mom and pull off this live event and working, 18-hour days. And so my husband flew up to Vegas, and he was that guy in the baby Bjorn, like The Hangover, with my son in the baby Bjorn, following me around so that I could work, and then I could feed my son and then hand him back to his dad. And he's walking through the casino with the baby and his baby Bjorn. But it's what we do for fantasy football. I mean, this is what we do to make sure that the draft must go on. So that was something that was pretty funny. I would say one other neat story to share was a few years ago, Tony Romo helped us lobby for fantasy sports in Texas. This was just after he retired, and it was right before he accepted the job with CBS Sports. So he needed to be prepped on how to lobby and what to say and get ready to talk to lawmakers. And it turned out that the day that he needed to be prepped was my daughter's 10th birthday. My daughter, big Cowboys fan, huge Romo fan. I was able to surprise her with a trip to Dallas, and she got to meet Tony Romo and sit down and have a conversation with him. And he's just as nice as you would expect. But what an awesome gift to be able to give my child to meet their, hero, their sports hero. And it was on her birthday, and somebody like Tony Romo, who's just pleasant and kind and considerate. And he was a heck of a lobbyist, let me tell you. He was sharp and informed and smart, and wow. I can't believe that we haven't been able to get fantasy sports passed in Texas, because he was quite the spokesperson.
Wow. So did you let your daughter know, or did you say, we're going to Dallas, and then you bump into Roma, or did you let her know in advance?
I did not let her know in advance. Coincidentally, my in-laws live in the same area that he lives in. So we flew to Dallas. She knew there was some sort of surprise, but she wasn't sure what. She thought maybe she was getting a puppy. And so we walked into the room where we were going to meet with him, and he comes walking in a different door, and he knew she was going to be there. So he immediately put his focus on her, and he was terrific.
I wish I'd have been there to see that. That's a great idea, and I'm glad that worked out. It's hilarious. Back a little bit. I forgot to ask you, do you remember your first fantasy draft?
I don't remember the first draft, but I do remember that I had Priest Holmes, and I was pumped. So this was in 2002, because in 2001, when I started playing fantasy football, I just played with the salary cap style. Yes. 2002 was the first year I drafted, and I remember I ended up with Priest Holmes because I knew I had to go running back, and it paid off.
That's good. Oh, I forgot to ask. Way back when, it may have been on that screen, I'm not sure, what was the tagline for Head2Head?
Get your head in the game.
Very good. You win. Ding, 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 ding. And I forgot to put this up. I don't know if I put this up or not. That's your inaugural 2003 The Draft website. There's a box at the top that didn't show up under the Wayback Machine, unfortunately. And you actually had a separate... you kind of fashioned the whole ad with the Venetian kind of style, I guess.
Yep, we sure did. Yeah, created a whole new site for that.
Yeah, The Draft 2003. You probably had a 4. I don't really know or not, but cool.
Oh, yeah.
I've ran out of questions. And did you have any other things you'd like to talk about?
No, I don't. I feel so incredibly lucky that I get to do what I love for a living, and I am blessed, and I don't take it for granted. And I hope that I can continue to support the industry in the best way possible.
Well, congratulations on being a pioneer of fantasy sports, and it's really exciting, frosting on the cake to be the president of the trade association. It's going to be fun. I have a really feeling you're going to do a great job, and I'm looking forward to it. I haven't been to any. I was on the board for 6 years, and some of those overlap when you were on. And I just got a little old, and I wanted to really focus on my business, so I got off the board. And I hadn't been to an event for a while, and I did go to January in Vegas, and it was great. I really had a great time. I love the elevator pitch.
Yes. Isn't that exciting?
I think it's a fantastic tool and great for the new companies, and that's just a wonderful idea. Well, anyway, thank you so much, and congratulations again, and good luck in the future and all the stuff you've already done.
Thank you very much, and thank you to you for always being supportive. For years and years, we've had conversations, and I remember being at Head2Head, and you and I having long conversations about the industry, and you've always been supportive of me, and I really appreciate that.
I'm glad. I'm glad to hear that. Fantastic. Thank you.
Okay.